And one, and you're live.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Flora Mujaz and I'll be your moderator. If you want to ask any questions at any point, please post them in the Zoom chat and we'll try to get through as many as possible during the Q&A at the end. This track is going to focus on psychometrics, so how we measure the psychological effects of psychedelics. In my lab in Zurich, where we're currently conducting a number of clinical studies, including psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for depression and alcoholism, we usually use the 5D ASC, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So the main advantage of this scale is that it's very highly validated. It's been used for over 30 years, and it was designed to capture altered states of consciousness induced by many different methods, so both pharmacological and non-pharmacological. However, there are a number of limitations to the 5D ASC, which are also applicable to other widely used scales in the field, so I'll touch upon them briefly here. First of all, the 5D ASC only really captures acute effects, and certainly not all the effects of psychedelics or altered states of consciousness, especially not the more negative ones. But as the questionnaire already has 90 items, it's not possible to just keep adding more and more questions. Otherwise, obviously, participants will get very tired and this will add more noise to the data. So we do really need to develop new questionnaires for the specific questions that come up. Another disadvantage of the 5D ASC is that it's usually administered retrospectively after the psychedelic session. And this really isn't ideal for capturing the dynamic nature of the psychedelic experience, but it's also debatable whether it is even really possible to capture acute effects during the trip if people are hardly able to read. And finally, the 5D ASC does not capture everything that may be interesting for clinical effects, partly as it was not really designed to do so. So for example, it doesn't capture things like how important is a challenging experiences or how they're resolved for the clinical efficacy of the substance session. And as the amount of psychedelic research, especially clinical research, being conducted increases, we see a lot of new questionnaires emerging. But it's really important to bear in mind, I think, that a lot of these are not necessarily well validated. So our two talks today are going to focus on the development of new instruments to address new questions. And so first of all, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Camilla Day, who will talk about the compassion experience scale. Camilla is a psychiatrist and is currently doing an MD Res at King's College London, investigating the role of self-compassion, phenomenology, and the therapeutic effect in psilocybin's relationship to treatment-resistant depression. So over to you, Camilla.
Hello, my name is Camilla Day and welcome to my talk on the development as of far of the psychedelic compassion experience scale to predict outcomes in psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. So who am I? I'm a psychiatry registrar in South London, about 2 months away from completing my training when I returned from maternity leave. I've just had a second daughter 2 months ago and I'm doing an MD Res, a slightly shorter version of a PhD with King's College London, funded by Mental Health Research UK in contextual factors in psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. I've been involved in psilocybin research since I volunteered as a female psychiatrist and guide in the open label pilot study Imperial. This was a very rewarding experience for me. I sat in I guided 22 dosing sessions for 11 patients, and I collaborated in qualitative research there with Rosalind Watts. So I'm doing my training at the Maudsley, and so I move now to the King Psychedelic Trials Group. My MD Res aims form part, my MD Res aims form part of the tertiary aims of a NIHR-funded feasibility RCT study in psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, which was a grant got by James Rucker, my supervisor. And these are my aims, and so part of this is to develop and validate a scale to measure the types of experiences that people have during a guided psilocybin trip that predict improvements in depression afterwards to be used within research and hopefully in the future in clinical settings. And then it's possible the scale can be validated to be used for other pathologies and other psychedelics. This slide shows you the steps of scale development, which is actually split into item development, the first 3 items there, scale development, the next 3, and then scale evaluation, the last 3. I shall now present to you my findings from the identification of domain and item generation, content validity, and pre-testing of questions. So the domain here is psychedelic experiences that lead to improvements in depression. And the purpose is to create a short, simple scale that can be used after dosing to predict outcome. The second step is to describe the domain and provide preliminary conceptual definition of it. In this case, what are the types of psychedelic experiences that lead to positive outcomes or improvements in depression? I've used both deductive and inductive processes in order to do this. Deductive by way of looking at the existing literature on this, and inductive from my own experience of being a guide and of carrying out qualitative research. Bill Richards and Peter Gasser have categorized different healing experiences as peak or mystical, archetypal, psychodynamic, and cognitive. And whilst peak or mystical experiences are highly predictive of positive change, these other experiences, types of experience, are also very important, which is why our scales other than the MEQ or altered states of consciousness are needed. So the recent psychological conceptualization have involved ideas related to ACT, or kind of third wave therapy, so ideas of connection and acceptance, psychological flexibility, emotional breakthrough, facilitated access to emotions, relational embeddedness. This was the first model of contextual factors that I constructed, not only including the psychological mediators of change that you can see in the middle there, but also these pre-dose predictive factors, but just ignore those for now and just focus in the middle. So from the kind of, from a thorough literature review and from the qualitative study, I sort of came up with these ideas, which I split into emotional experiencing, inter, and or transpersonal connection, and cognitive changes. However, I sort of wasn't quite happy with this kind of categorization. So as a guide, first of all, so when you're kind of describing the domain, you also need to specify the dimensions of the domain. So as a guide in the pilot study Imperial, I also noticed how many people appeared to have experiences of compassion either towards themselves or others. And in particular, I wondered if the 3 components of self-compassion as constructed by Kristen Neff as self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness would provide a better framework in which to categorize the helpful psychedelic experiences. And so I decided to use these as the dimensions of the domain. I'll show you now some quotes from participants in the Imperial study which relate to these 3 dimensions. So these quotes relate to self-kindness, and I'll let you read them so you have a break from my voice. And then these quotes relate to common humanity. And these quotes relate to mindfulness. I started to think, though, that these experiences didn't fit that well into compassion experiences, and I felt that the types of experiences people were having with psilocybin were broader than the components of self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness alone. And so they have now shifted into inner therapist, connection, and emotional experiencing. There's something very specific about a psychedelic healing experience in that it seems to always be uniquely person-centered and almost as if it's sort of custom-made for the person. Something which I think in itself is a strong predictor of positive outcome. And so I wanted to capture this in the scale. Therefore, I changed the self-kindness component to inner therapist. Here are some more quotes from participants in the Imperial study to show this further. So there seems to be this activation of an inner wisdom or inner therapist that sort of advises you about healthy life choices. And then, so in terms of common humanity, which is the sort of awareness that we're not alone in our suffering, but that everyone suffers, is can be one type of psychedelic experience. However, there's also the sense of something slightly different to that, like more of an interconnectedness or a connectedness to nature or to spirituality, as well as the experiences of ego dissolution, which are definitely different than this idea of common humanity. The dimension of mindfulness also appeared limited in that helpful psychedelic experiences appear to have an added dimension of intensity, and that some emotional experiences would be more in line with psychoanalytical ideas of catharsis and abreaction. And therefore I renamed this component emotional experiencing, although that's then back to my original naming as well. And so my three a priori components for the scale are inner therapist, connection, and emotional experiencing. And therefore, I think rather than compassion experience scale, I think it's the psychedelic compassion experience scale, which is a bit of a mouthful. I might have to amend that. Since starting to create my scale, 3 other scales are already in progress. The What's Connection scale, the Psychological Insight Questionnaire, and the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory. And it's important, not to just create another instrument for the sake of it. However, the Psychological Insight Questionnaire and the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory don't seem to have the added dimension of kind of connection in them. And then the What's Connection scale, which overlaps more conceptually with mine, although uses different language, is a 23-item scale. So much sort of quite a bit longer than I'm aiming to make. And also it's a scale that's measuring how connected you feel within the last 2 weeks, rather than it being a scale to be used directly after dosing to kind of quantify experiences. So I generated items for the scale using both deductive and inductive methods, creating at least twice as many questions as I desired to be in the final scale. My first scale had 28 items, and it included antithetical pairs of questions. So there were 5 pairs of questions for inner therapist, which are here. 4 pairs of questions for connection, and 6 pairs of questions for emotional experiencing. I used a 6-point scale using the following wording, and I sent this out to previous healthy volunteer psychedelic trial participants, including colleagues and some previous psychedelic trial patients who were on our NIHR steering committee, for feedback on wording using Qualtrics. Generally, the feedback was good and they felt I was covering the right kind of experiences. However, they said the questions were repetitive, particularly with the addition of the negative questions, which are also confusing. For example, answering the question, I experienced no change in my sense of intrinsic self-worth. First of all, how can you experience nothing? And if you were trying to answer that with definitely or not at all, it's a bit of a brain teaser. So I got rid of the negative questions and changed the wording of the introduction question and the scale to a Likert agreement-disagreement scale in order to give participants more chance of disagreeing with the statement. Here's the scale now half as long, but I've added one more item in connection to try and capture the idea of my consciousness mind. So there are 15 items in total. There are now 5 for inner therapist, 4 for connection, and 6 for emotional experiencing. I sent a content validity form to numerous experts I knew in the UK and the USA, explaining the conceptual development of the domain and dimensions, and then asking them to first choose which component they think each item fits into, and then to ask them to rate how strongly they agree whether each item is measuring each component. I got 10 responses, and there was general feedback that the use of prison of the mind, although often described in people who were depressed, was not the best wording. And I enjoyed this particular quote from an expert who I very much respect. His initials happen to be BR. Also, it was obvious that when I'd written feelings and insight or feelings and belief in the same item, that these created confusion between the inner therapist and emotional experiencing components. So I did a Fleiss Kappa on the component rating, and I performed this using Excel, using a broken down version of the formula. So with the 15 items, the coefficient was 0.64. From this table, which is a human construct, not really based on anything, there's what you call a substantial agreement there. So this I did on the second question, the Likert of agreement and disagreement with my components. And this is a proportion agreement, so there was 0.92. This sounds very high, although this doesn't take into account the chance. Now, if I remove 3 items, one from inner therapist about experiencing a positive change in my beliefs and feelings about myself, and 2 from emotional experiencing, so bodily sensations led to new insight, and a question I was able to go in and through emotions or memories, I get a Fleiss Kappa of 0.78, which is a slightly higher substantial agreement. So these are the items that I have removed, 2 from emotional experiencing and 1 from inner therapist. And I've changed these 3 items, and I believe that the top item about discovering new insights and feelings of love would have much improved if, this top question, I discovered new insights about myself, that question would very much improve the inter-rater agreement compared to I discovered new insights and feelings of love towards myself because of the confusion with inner therapist and emotional experiencing. So this is the most recent form of the scale, which we shall be giving to the patients on the CIDR trial. That has just been given the go-ahead by MHRA and HRA, which is great. So there we are, there's the 12 item scale. So thank you for listening, and I'll take your questions in a bit.
Thank you so much for the talk, Camilla. So we'll now move on to Ricarda Evans, who will be talking about the development of the Afterglow inventory. Ricarda Evans is a psychologist and CBT-trained psychotherapist based in Berlin, whose research is focused on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
Can you hear me and see the presentation? Could somebody give me a feedback whether you hear me? Well, I will just start, so please give me a feedback if you don't hear me. So, hello and thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Ricarda Evans and I'm speaking to you from Berlin, Germany today, and I will guide you through the process of development and validation of the Afterglow Inventory, a new instrument to measure positive subacute effects after psychedelic substance use. So let me start with a brief overview of what you can expect from the next 15 minutes. First, I'll give you a little bit of background information on why we put that much effort into development of this new instrument. I'll then guide you through the process of development and validation of the Afterglow Inventory. And finally, I will present our preliminary results to you. The pandemic slowed down our recruitment process quite a bit, so that data are not as final as I would have wished them to be. Nevertheless, I think I can show some quite interesting interim results to you. I know that psychometrics sometimes do not seem to be the most exciting topic. However, I try to spice it up a little bit by omitting slides full of methods and numbers. However, if you're interested in those in more detail, I do have some in the backup slides. So why do we need another questionnaire? The short answer here is because there is no instrument available yet specifically designed to measure subacute effects. And we were convinced, or actually we are convinced, that in addition to the acute and more long-term, the subacute effects might be a very interesting period to look at. For the people in the audience that may be not so familiar with the terminology, you find here a schematic overview of the course of the psychedelic effects. With acute effects, I refer to effects in which the person is still under the influence of the drug and which may or may not involve a peak experience of very strong effects. If I talk about subacute effects, on the other hand, I refer to effects that persist or cure after the acute effects have subsided and that are considered to gradually fade out or fade into a residual long-term effect that can be stable for months or even years. We were, however, not interested in capturing the whole range of possible subacute effects. Instead, we focused on capturing a specific subset of subacute effects that also has been labeled the psychedelic afterglow, as this constitutes an extremely fascinating phenomenon to look at. And we thought that in order to be able to investigate this more, we would first have to create an instrument to measure it. So what is a psychedelic afterglow? Roughly speaking, it's a specific combination of predominantly positive subacute effects that may last up to 2 to 4 weeks. However, please read this number with caution because we actually don't know much about the inter-individual variability of these effects. And it could be that we also see much longer or shorter durations. The phenomenon is not new, it's not something we came up with. It has been described already in the early days of psychedelic research. So let me give you some quotes that illustrate how the afterglow has been described. For example, Parker writes, mood is elevated and energetic. There's a relative freedom from concerns of the past and from guilt and anxiety, and the disposition and capacity to enter into close interpersonal relationship is enhanced. There's a unique opportunity for effective psychotherapeutic work on strained family or other interpersonal relationships. Colin adds, it's a radiant and positive feeling of well-being that often connotes a real change in values, an increase in spirituality, a decrease in meaningless goals, less emphasis on material things, a feeling of being more at home in life, and a greater appreciation of life's possibilities. And Alborn Anderson writes, it's a carryover period marked by increased openness and willingness to communicate. So key aspects seem to be elevated mood, optimism, confidence, enhanced interpersonal feelings and behaviors, some form of clarity of thought. However, and this brings us to the main challenge we face. While there are a lot of description, there is no real clear definition of the afterglow phenomenon, which made it very hard to decide what to include into the questionnaire, because as with any instrument, you'll only find what you are looking for. We therefore put a lot of effort into item generation and selection, which I will describe in more detail now. So first of all, we generated a great number of items based on anything we've ever heard about the afterglow. We got inspired by previous descriptions, experience reports, other skills that may capture sub-aspects of the afterglow. And then sorted them by categories, deleted duplicates, brought them into uniform wording, etc. And doing that, I observed that some aspects were a little bit underrepresented. And we actively tried to generate more items for these categories. And seeing the categories also inspired us to create more categories and more items. So it was really here an iterative process. We presented this item list to a number of expert advisors that were so wonderful to give us their opinion and valuable feedback on the item list. And based on that, we reformulated, added, or removed items from the original item list. In the end, we took a little bit more than 100 items, including some control items, into the validation process, being aware that there is a trade-off between length and probability of participants to fill out the survey. What I did not mention yet is we designed the items bilingual in English and German language. So we chose a visual analog scale to capture the effects, and on this slide you can see an example of the initial item that went into the validation process. So it's not all of them, it's some of them. The instruction to the participant was to judge to what extent the statements applied to their experience during the days following their last consumption of the substance as compared to their normal everyday experience. So after we had the initial item list ready, of course, we still had to prove that with the items we can actually measure what we hope to measure, the afterglow. So we choose to do that using the format of an online survey. To me, it was very important to not capture retrospective memories of the afterglow, but to assess people that are actually within the period of a potential afterglow. We therefore asked only participants to take part in this survey that had taken psychedelics in the last 4 weeks. Goals of the surveys were the following. First, we wanted to run an exploratory factor analysis on the factor structure. Second, we wanted to select the good items and reduce the total item number of the questionnaire. And third, we wanted to test whether the afterglow is actually specific to psychedelic substances. For that last goal, we added a control group that filled out the questionnaire after they had used non-psychedelic substances. And this could include amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine, or opioids. So what did we find out? I'm just going to talk about the results in the English-speaking sample, and the German sample is still too small to draw meaningful conclusions from. Of a little bit more than 2,000 participants that filled out the questionnaire, 409 data sets fulfilled all criteria to go into the exploratory factor analysis. For reasons of clarity, I did not put detailed information on the methods applied on the slides, but I do have them in the backup, as I mentioned before. For those of you that are familiar with the different methods, I used principal axis factoring based on the correlation metrics, applying factor rotation using an oblique rotation method that basically allows factors to be correlated with each other. What I observed is that a 5-factor structure solution best describes the factor structure with a very strong first factor that alone describes a great deal of the observed variance, and that the number of items can also be greatly reduced while still capturing relevant information. So let me guide you through the 5 factors, but please keep in mind that the data is still preliminary and we do not have yet decided on the final item selection, and also factor names are still subject to discussion. So the first factor, which seems to be the strongest, is a factor that captures a range of positive intrapersonal effects that I have labeled positive mood for now. And this includes items like I'm in a good mood, I'm confident that my life will be good, I'm optimistic, I enjoy my life, I experience inner peace, I'm free from feelings of guilt, I feel ease in my life. Second factor included more interpersonal effects that can be described with empathy or something like connectedness, and would include items like I feel compassion towards other people, I care about other people, I feel love towards other people, I feel emotionally connected to other people, and I'm sensitive to other people's needs. The third factor describes more transpersonal effects about the unity of things, like I'm aware of life in all things. I feel that all is one. I feel connected to nature. I feel that everything is interconnected, and I notice nature around me. The first factor describes something that I would call an enhanced intuition or feeling of seeing things clearly, and includes items like I can see my weaknesses clearly, I'm honest with myself, I feel connected to my intuition, I perceive things the way they really are, I can recollect some past experience in my life with great clarity. And the last factor I labeled enjoyment, with items describing something like an enhanced sensitivity of the senses, including items like I experience sexuality as enjoyable, I feel desire for sex, I enjoy tasty food, I clearly perceive the taste of food, I enjoy physical contact with people I like. With the reduced version, we also find good reliability measures. And to the last question, are those subacute effects specific to psychedelics? I can also say yes. So we observed that the mean score of the Afterglow inventory was significantly higher in people after they took psychedelics compared to the score of the participants that took non-psychedelic drugs. So what's next? As I mentioned before, we developed the instrument bilingual in English and German. So before we decide on the final solution of the reduced item list in the final questionnaire, we want to wait for the German sample to be sure we choose items that work well in both languages. We then plan to run a second survey with the reduced item number to replicate the factor structure. So we would be very grateful if you could keep sharing our link, which you find here. It's afterglow-service.org. And as I mentioned, the survey is available in English and German. So before I come to an end, I want to mention and thank the great team and people involved in developing the Afterglow inventory, Tomislav Majic and Timo Torsten Schmidt. Both of them were part of the core team to develop the instrument. And I would also like to thank our cooperation partners and expert advisors that helped us with their valuable feedback. I want to thank Bill Richards and Peter Gasser for taking much time to provide their detailed feedback and help us with the item generation and selection. I also want to thank Rick Strassmann and Ulrich Ott, who also provided feedback on our first item list. And I want to thank Anna Gröticke, that helped us with the setup of the online survey. Yeah, last but not least, I want to thank you, the audience, for being interested in our new inventory. And I'm really looking forward to an interesting discussion with you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ricarda. So we now have about 10 minutes left for the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your Zoom. And we're also hoping that Camilla will be able to join us for this part. But for now, maybe we'll start off with the first question, which is for Ricarda, which is, do you worry there is some inherent positive bias in the name of your psychometric? So for example, glow might suggest a brighter experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh. Sorry, I was gone for a second. Yeah, well, that is there is a positive bias, and that has a reason, because as I mentioned.
Excuse me, Ricarda. Could you please unshare your screen? Then we can all see you.
Okay, sorry.
Perfect, thanks.
All right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, there is a positive bias, and that also has a reason, because we only wanted to capture the positive subacute effects, or what we would call this afterglow phenomenon. So it's not a survey that captures all kind of subacute effects.
Okay, and then the second question is, did you see any differences among substances? So I guess, yeah, from the survey you had, were you able to see if there was, for example, a difference in the length of the afterglow effect or anything like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And of course, I already took a look at it. I do have to say, so we included a number of psychedelics, but most of the participants filled it out after taking LSD or psilocybin. So the other psychedelics, we really have much, much lower numbers. But so I did observe some differences, and so the substance with the highest afterglow was 5-MeO-DMT, and the one with the lowest was 2-CB. Yeah, but this said, all of them, like all of the different psychedelics, showed a high afterglow. But you know, within the different or between the different substances, we also find differences. Yes.
And then, yeah, just so everybody knows, Camilla is also present in the chat. I don't know if she's going to be able to join the Q&A live via Zoom, but if you want to post any questions, she can certainly answer them within the chat. And so now we have, I'll just keep going with the questions for Ricardo in the meantime. We have another question. Could you further validate the AGI by surveying individuals that used psychedelics 4 to 8 weeks ago with the hypothesis that this afterglow is now somewhat reduced? And then you would distinguish a medium-term afterglow rather than a general lasting effect.
I mean, that is a very good idea, I guess. Of course, one can do that. We decided to do like 4 weeks because we really wanted to make sure that people are within the afterglow while they fill out the survey. If you look at people like after maybe 8 weeks or 12 weeks, the probability, it's very, gets smaller and smaller that people are still in the afterglow. And also there will be a transition to long-term or a residual effects that maybe are not so much the afterglow effect anymore. So as we see in the studies with depression right now, that you also find long-term antidepressant effects. So there will be effects that are not only the afterglow, the more long-term effects.
And maybe this is a question for both of you, but maybe we can start with Camilla now that she's joined the Q&A. What sort of long-term applications do you see for your scale?
Hi everybody, sorry I didn't know what happened there. I couldn't get my video on, but I was listening the whole way through. And also sorry, I've got a little baby here, so I'm a little bit busy as well. But in terms of long-term applications, I see it, so yeah, my scale, I want it to be used as an after dosing, so straight after dosing, you use my scale as just a very short scale, and it's going to give you an idea of how kind of powerful was the experience that people have, and whether that's actually going to give some kind of positive outcome. And I'm talking about really people in depression. Possibly, obviously, it could be used for other pathologies in the future. So you'll have an idea during integration, like, okay, what kind of experience did this person have in a kind of measurable, quantifiable way, which I know obviously at the same time is a kind of anti-psychedelic idea, but I think it will be useful. So it will be useful within research and then also clinically.
And then, yeah, I guess the same question for Ricardo as well. What sort of long-term applications would you see ideally for the afterglow inventory?
Well, I think there are many. Like the one that I'm interested in is, I guess, to understand a little bit better how the subacute afterglow period actually relates to more long-term therapeutic effects, and to maybe relate acute effects, the acute effects with the subacute effects, so to see whether like there is a direct relation between the acute effects and then the potential afterglow, but also to see whether substances differ actually in their profile. So right now we find a 5-factor structure, and it would be also interesting to see whether different substances differ in their profile, that maybe some substances increase more the interpersonal aspects of the afterglow. Maybe some substances have a stronger effect on mood. This would be something that I would be interested in.
And then just, yeah, and maybe just time for 1 or 2 more questions. So yeah, for Ricardo again, were you concerned at all with any sort of, obviously it was a survey that you ran, were you concerned with any sort of self-selection bias in terms of who would be taking the drugs and filling out the survey, and how do you sort of deal with that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And yes, I'm concerned with that. But I did not really find a way to avoid that, because we really need high numbers of people to fill out the questionnaire, to really see, to really investigate the factor structure. But of course, I do think there could be a bias, that just people that are very convinced by psychedelics fill out the questionnaire. This could be, yes.
And then the next question for Camilla. Can you comment on how you as a therapist have either grown to be more expecting of positive or negative results from patients based on watching their response to the dosages? Or yeah, is it possible to tell it all in advance, or yeah, just any sort of insights from your own personal experience?
I mean, it's funny that I'm trying to create a scale to predict outcome, because I think it's really hard to predict outcome. Particularly, I mean, in a way, I'm predicting outcome kind of after they've had the experience, so that's a bit different. But before, in terms of before the dosing, I think it's very hard to predict, and you never know. You really never know what someone's going to experience. So I think I learned to really keep an open mind. Yeah, actually to really keep an open mind, and to know that I'm not the therapist. The psilocybin is the therapist. Well, the psilocybin plus the music plus the person themselves, they're the therapist. And so basically to respect the process, and kind of, yeah, be humble kind of before it. Sorry, that didn't really answer your question. I think I was a bit distracted by my baby. Sorry.
No, I think that answered perfectly. Okay, I think that's all that we have time for at the moment with the Q&A. So yeah, I just want to say again, thank you all so much for joining us, and a huge thank you to Ricardo and Camilla for such wonderful talks. And we will be having a virtual meetup afterwards if anyone has any more questions. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.